It's my pleasure to introduce Professor David Myddelton here. And I noticed that he's been a professor of finance and accounting for a very long time, since 1972, at the very prestigious Cranfield School of Management. And I was reflecting that accountancy is not the oldest profession in the world, but it is certainly a very ancient one. In my opening speech, I did mention about the Medes and the Persians. Well, we know quite a lot about them because they had accountants, and they put their accounts onto clay tablets. And these were kept, and when they got the answer they wanted, they were put into an oven and baked, and that was the first occasion on which they cooked the books. Professor Myddelton, he's also the chairman of the Institute of Economic Affairs, a very high-powered think tank. But he's not going to be talking to us directly on finance and accounting, although that is the notation of the success or failure of businesses and countries, but on political reasons for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. Good.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think I should say now for something completely different, or at least somewhat different. As you know, Britain's membership of the European Union may soon be the subject of an in-out referendum, so those of us who want the United Kingdom to leave the EU are starting to assemble our arguments. People who want us to stay in the EU normally concentrate on economic matters, as they did when arguing for Britain to join the common market in the first place. But most studies show no net economic benefit from our EU membership. After all, we can trade perfectly well with the continent, whether we're in the EU or not. Other countries, America, Brazil, China, and so on, do so perfectly well. They manage to trade with the EU from the outside. As you know, some people pretend that 3 million British jobs might be at risk if we left the EU. But that's complete nonsense. There's no reason to expect any permanent loss of jobs. It's not, after all, as if we gained 3 million jobs when we joined the common market. The fact is, both sides to a voluntary market transaction expect to benefit, and that will remain true whether we stay in the EU or not. Moreover, tariff levels are far lower now than they were when we joined back in 1972. So being outside the EU's customs union would matter far less now than it might once have done. Exports are 30% of our national output, but less than half of our total exports go to the European Union, a smaller proportion than for any other member state. So UK exports to the rest of the EU represent less than 15% of our GDP, and demographic changes in the EU mean that this proportion will get even smaller in future. Meanwhile, the economic benefits of EU membership, such as they are, apply to less than 15% of our GDP, but the EU's economic regulations and red tape, extensive as they are a disproportionate burden on 100% of our economy. Finally, on the economic side, no political British leaders currently argue that we should enter the single currency. And if the economic reasons for staying in the EU were so strong, one can't help wondering why not. The fact is, any such suggestion would simply be laughed out of court. So in my opinion, the main reason for the UK to leave the EU is political. It's perhaps worth thinking, why did we join in the first place? It was a mistake. In 1970, there was a feeling that perhaps we should join the common market. It was viewed as an economic and trade arrangement. Ted Heath, the new Prime Minister, was obviously in favour. He was perfectly open about that, and he was very keen on going in. Moreover, at that time, it seemed that the French and German economies had been pretty successful in the 25 post-war years, whereas the British economy had been very weak. So in 1973, we did join, along with Ireland and Denmark, and in 1975, as you know, we voted 2-1 in the referendum to stay in. But after Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister, the British economy started to recover, while the continental economies faltered. So the economic conditions that had made it seem sensible to join the common market in the 1960s and early 70s began to reverse in the 1980s and 90s after we had joined. Ever since the 1975 referendum, I've been arguing for us to leave first the common market, then the European Economic Community, then the European Community, and now the European Union. Confucius said, a person who's made a mistake and doesn't correct it is making another mistake. And joining the common market 40 years ago has turned out to be a serious mistake for the EU and for the UK. Now we may get the chance to put that right, though I must point out that an in-out referendum by 2017 is by no means a sure thing. It's been more or less promised by a politician, but I think we know how much value that holds. In my view, the political arguments against British membership of the European Union is much more important than the economic argument. That's not surprising, since from the beginning, the EU has been a political project. But the Europhiles always tend to gloss over that aspect. I've got 4 or 5 different aspects I want to talk about. First of all, we're different. In 1963, President de Gaulle of France rejected our application to join the common market. He said this, I'm translating, England is bound by its trade, its markets, its food supplies, to the most varied and often very different countries. Her activity is essentially industrial and commercial, not agricultural. She has very strong, very individual habits and traditions. In short, the nature, structure, and circumstances peculiar to England are different from those of the other continental countries. He was absolutely right, and his words to me still resonate 50 years later. I well remember, and I expect many of you in this room remember, the 1975 referendum asking us, should we stay in? The Economist newspaper, strongly pro-EU as always, produced a big book with a yellow cover setting out its economic arguments in detail. But I just felt, when it came to actually voting, we're too different from them. We are too different from the continental Europeans. In effect, I shared the Gaullist view, so I voted no. The continental countries' histories and traditions aren't the same as ours. Different doesn't mean better or worse, but our ways suit us, and many of their ways don't. It's not just the historical experience, but the language, the money, the legal system, and the general political culture too. After all, that's why we call them foreigners. They're different. After the war, Churchill was keen to reconcile France and Germany and called for a united Europe. But he didn't envisage us being part of that Europe. He told de Gaulle, every time Britain has to choose between Europe and the open sea, it is always the open sea that we shall choose. Anthony Eden, Foreign Secretary for so many years, shared that view. He said, suggestions have been made that the United Kingdom should join a federation on the continent of Europe. This is something which we know in our bones we cannot do, for Britain's interests lie far beyond the continent of Europe. That's still true today. The British are an island race of global traders. We've always had a worldwide outlook, rather than a parochial European one. Far from being little Englanders, the whole world is our oyster. At last year's Olympic Games in London, athletes from 200 nations marched past in the very long opening ceremony. I reckon about half of those countries had at one time in their history been British colonies or had very close ties with the British Empire. That's a remarkably high proportion. No other country has anything like such a worldwide network of overseas connections on every continent. A year ago, there was an opinion poll which asked people, which of 5 selected countries would you say Britain has most in common with, culturally, politically, and economically? These countries were selected in advance, they weren't random. 2% said India, 10% Germany, and 11% France. But 28% said Australia, more than India, Germany, and France combined, and 49% said the United States of America. I think there's a bit of a lesson there for Europhiles. And we must remember that geography matters much less now than it did even 50 years ago. Air travel is faster and cheaper, as are telecommunications. And of course, the internet is revolutionizing business. So being next door to the continent of Europe is no longer that important. There are basic differences in philosophy too. Britons tend to hold that knowledge depends on experience, one might say trial and error. We're sceptical and cautious, while tolerant of different approaches. But continental Europeans claim that ideas matter most. They tend to be less flexible and more dogmatic. Harold Macmillan expanded on this point when discussing Concorde, the Anglo-French prestige project. It was an engineering triumph, but a commercial disaster. He said, the difference is temperamental and intellectual. The continentals, he said, like to reason from the top downwards, from general principles to practical application, the tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas. The Anglo-Saxons like to argue from the bottom up, from practical experience, the tradition of Bacon and Newton. And these contrasts in national style and approach persisted throughout Concorde's development. French elite technocrats had trained academically at the École Polytechnique, whereas the British engineers had served a long apprenticeship on the shop floor. The French were more hierarchical, while the British tended to regard a firm instruction from above merely as the basis for discussion. This was reminiscent of the Duke of Wellington's alleged comment on his first cabinet meeting as Prime Minister. He said, "An extraordinary affair. I gave them their orders and they wanted to stay behind and discuss them." More than one European leader has proclaimed that the nation state is dead. That gives a clue to the United Kingdom's future inside the European Union: disintegration. The Committee of the Regions aims to foster direct links between the centre and regions of member states. Thus, it bypasses national governments. That's why so many regions now have their own offices in Brussels. It's been suggested by Peter Shaw that European federalists will pursue any objective provided that it achieves 2 basic aims. It weakens the powers of the elected governments of nation states, and it strengthens the powers of the European institutions. Europhiles like to talk about increasing the UK's influence in world affairs by being part of a larger and more powerful bloc. But it's clear the EU would gladly elbow us out of our Security Council seat at the United Nations. That's a strange way to maximise British influence. Much of our legislation now originates abroad. Hayek foresaw such a development in his wartime book, The Road to Serfdom. He wrote a very interesting chapter on international developments. If we stay in the EU, how many of our laws will be coming from Brussels in 20 years' time, say? Will it be even more than the 80% that Jacques Delors boasted about many years ago? Roy Jenkins has been the only British president of the European Commission so far. In 1999, he said this: "There are only 2 coherent British attitudes to Europe. One is to participate fully and endeavour to exercise as much influence and gain as much benefit as possible from the inside. The other," he said, "is to recognise that Britain's history, national psychology and political culture may be such that we can never be anything but a foot-dragging and constantly complaining member, and that it would be better to move towards an orderly and, if possible, reasonably amicable separation. That's from Roy Jenkins. The preamble to the Treaty of Rome sets out the EU's fundamental objective of ever closer union. But as David Cameron implied in his Bloomberg speech earlier this year, we in this country have never been comfortable with it. To begin with, we ignored it. We thought it was a bit of the preamble that simply didn't matter. How wrong we were. For a long time, most British people simply couldn't believe that the continental politicians were serious about ever closer union. Many Eurosceptics still make this mistake. But be in no doubt, whatever the views of their electorates, the European leaders are deadly serious. They really mean it. Some years ago, the EEC Official General Guide said, economic integration isn't meant to be an end in itself, but merely an intermediate stage on the road to political integration. And over the years, many political leaders on the continent have clearly explained that what they aspire to is nothing less than a United States of Europe. And if you look back in the literature, it's amazing how often that phrase has been used, long before the start of the common market, all through the 20th century. Many politicians on the continent have said that's what they want, especially, one can't help noticing, rather a lot of Germans. Had it been called the United States of Europe from the start, we'd have understood better what we were getting into. But those British politicians who wanted us to go in realised that such a goal, if openly proclaimed, would have been extremely unpopular, to put it mildly. Ted Heath's 1971 white paper was deliberately not telling the truth when it said there's no question of any erosion of essential national sovereignty. Hardly anyone in Britain, then or now, wants to join a United States of Europe. It would mean abandoning our national soul to become an insignificant part of a European collective. And for more than 400 years, a key element in Britain's foreign policy has been to prevent any single power dominating the continent of Europe, whether Spain, France, Germany, or Russia. We've opposed Philip II, Louis XIV, Napoleon, the Kaiser, Hitler, Stalin, sometimes all on our own. But now, if most countries in Europe want to combine in a single would-be superstate, qualified majority voting means that we British can't stop them. We don't want to join them, but do we even really want to encourage them? That seems to be our government's policy. As was mentioned earlier, the 17-strong Euro bloc can now often outvote the UK, and this imbalance is likely to get worse over time. Because of the 10 non-Euro member states, only Denmark and the UK have an opt-out. So all but Denmark and the UK are legally bound to join the euro sooner or later. So if we were to stay inside the EU, but outside the euro, assuming they both survive, that would eventually make it only 2 countries outside the euro versus 25 in. As far as I know, not a single leading British politician, however Europhile, has openly argued for us to be part of a Europe-wide political union. Not Heath, not Howe, not Hurd, not Heseltine, not Clark. This appears to be the urge to merge that dare not speak its name. The Euro experiment has failed, like the snake and the ERM before it. I well remember, as many of you probably do, the UK's ejection from the ERM over 20 years ago. But it wasn't leaving the ERM that was the disaster, it was joining it. In fact, as soon as we left and reduced interest rates to suit ourselves, the UK economy recovered almost at once. In the same way, it was setting up the single currency that was the real disaster. I can't understand why British governments keep telling EU leaders to save the euro. Since the euro never made economic sense, saving it is a futile policy. They'll never, this is a prediction, they'll never be able to agree on an orderly dismantling of the euro. So here's another prediction. A disorderly breakup of the euro is now very much on the cards. The Eurocrats say they've got the political will to save the euro. But let's remember, it was their misguided political will that created the mess in the first place. Another aspect of ever closer union, of course, is the EU's acquis communautaire, the ratchet, which means that powers always flow towards Brussels and the centre, never back towards the member states. And some of you will know Bernard Connolly's comment that to offend against it appears to be a mixture of heresy, blasphemy, and treason. Continuing stealthy EU progress towards ever closer union has been graphically described as a coup d'etat by installments. Could Britain ever convince the rest of the EU to reform? You only really have to ask the question to know the answer. It's what we in the trade call a rhetorical question. But I will answer it. Not a chance. The Euro fanatics, many of them perfectly sincere, are quite incorrigible. Cameron may well do what Wilson did, pretend he's had a great triumph when he's got absolutely nowhere. The European Union doesn't respect the rule of law. In 1998, there were a dozen applicants to join the new single currency. Denmark, Sweden, and the UK chose not to join, while Greece's application was put off for a couple of years. How many of the 11 remaining countries applying to join the euro actually met all 5 of the Maastricht criteria for entry? Another rhetorical question, and again I'll answer it. Only one, tiny Luxembourg, with a population of less than 1% of the EU total. Strictly speaking, therefore, Luxembourg should have broken its currency union with Belgium, entered the euro all on its own, and thus increased by 1 the number of separate currencies in Europe. What a paradox for the so-called single currency that would have been, if they'd stuck to the rules. But instead, they chose to ignore the terms of a solemn international treaty. When the rules are inconvenient, that's what the EU does. For example, within the first few years, both France and Germany blatantly ignored the Stability and Growth Pact. So the foundations of the experimental single currency were flimsy indeed. It's no surprise that it's now on the verge of collapse. So far, there have been bailouts for Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Cyprus, and various kinds of assistance for Spain and Italy. These all clearly breach the terms of the Treaty of Maastricht. Unelected technocratic governments have been imposed on Greece and Italy. And in the Eurozone, elected national governments are being thrown out almost every time democratic elections are held. Last month, the government of Cyprus proposed to seize a chunk of people's bank deposits, despite the absence of any law permitting such action. This immoral scheme had the approval of the European Commission and the European Central Bank, as well as the IMF. In the Cyprus Parliament, there wasn't a single vote in favour. They came up with a revised version, what you might call modified confiscation, as a second go. The EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights purports to give Britain's rights we've enjoyed under common law for 1,000 years. But a sinister clause allows the EU to suspend these rights if it deems that to be in its collective interest. And talking of 1,000 years, let's remember that even William the Conqueror in 1066 promised to uphold the laws of England. That the Eurocrats have never done that. It's never crossed their mind. Maitland said the Star Chamber was a court of politicians enforcing a policy, not a court of judges enforcing the law. Much the same is true of the European Court of Justice, which sees its main purpose as being to promote European integration. That's very different from the British view that law should protect individuals against the state, hence habeas corpus, hence trial by jury, both now, of course, under threat. And Sir Patrick Neal has observed, a court with a mission is a menace, a supreme court with a mission is a tyranny. And indeed, I must say, I regard the European Union as an alien tyranny. Alien because it's mostly run by foreigners, and a tyranny because we can't throw the rascals out. Of course we're happy to trade with people on the continent, as we've done for many hundreds of years, and we'll gladly play football with them. Of course they don't play cricket. But we don't want to be ruled by them. The European Union has been carefully designed to be not international, between nation states, but supranational, above nation states. So the EU, as someone said, is anti-democratic. The democratic deficit isn't just a regrettable byproduct. All along, it's been a deliberately planned part of this project of an empire. None of the three key EU institutions is elected: the Commission, the Central Bank, or the Court of Justice. And the peoples of Europe certainly don't regard themselves as belonging to a single country. So even if there were an elected government of the United States of Europe, it would hardly be legitimate. European leaders are always desperate to prevent the public expressing their opinion about anything that matters. And when a referendum can't be avoided, if the result goes the wrong way, the people concerned, the culprits one might call them, are placed on the naughty step. They're told to go back and vote again until they get it right. It sounds like a joke, but it's not. That's the EU's totalitarian mindset. They can't understand why we get upset about it. Many Europeans have experienced that approach within living memory, whether in pre-war Italy, or Germany, or Spain, or in France during the war, or in the Soviet satellites of Eastern Europe after the war. Some people may indeed prefer dictatorship to democracy, but it doesn't suit the British. You can hardly imagine Hitler stepping down after the war if he'd lost an election, which is exactly what Churchill did. That's the British way. It's not the European way. We are too different politically for continuing in the EU to make sense. And if we in this country were to regain our political freedom by leaving the European Union, it would do more to restore national self-confidence than anything else one could imagine. Thank you.